and transcription. So welcome everyone to Sam's Candidature review. Just of course today Joseph and Baljinder are the principal supervisors, principal being Joseph and Baljinder being co-supervisor, and our expert panel today is Professor Keon Yap as the expert, Dr. Emma Bradshaw as the expert, or company led by Professor Teresa Dickey as the chair. So without any further ado, Sam, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, hi. Yeah, thanks for the introduction, and hi everyone. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to present my mid-review today. I'll walk you through my current PhD research and give you an update on how this project has developed since my confirmation of candidature. And so I'm going to start with the background and the main question guiding the thesis, and then I'm going to move through the work I've completed so far and where the research is headed next. So to start with the theoretical background, my thesis sits within self-determination theory, and it's a broad theory of motivation and well-being. And yeah, so we've got these basic needs, and yeah, so autonomy refers to feelings that your actions are chosen and self-endorsed rather than feeling pressured or controlled. And competence refers to feeling effective and capable and feeling you can use and develop your abilities. So yeah, relatedness is you feel others are connected to you and you have a sense of belonging. And SDT, so I'm just going to get a drink. So yeah, we've got a thwarting, which is sort of the opposite, where the frustration of these needs, they get actively blocked or violated, and it's where you can feel ineffective or rejected, and it's associated with poorer well-being. And frustration is not the absence of satisfaction, but a more active negative experience. So I want to talk about the organic assumption, and it's essentially the idea that the relationship observed at the group level may not necessarily reflect each individual. So there's two key levels to this problem, and the first is the distinction between person and within relationships. So for example, if people who generally report higher competence also report higher well-being, that tells us the differences between people, but it does not tell us whether a particular person feels better on days when their own competence is higher than usual. Repeated measure research helps address this by following the same people over time and separating between person differences from changes within the same person. But there is a second issue, and this is when the main focus of my thesis. So even if a daily diary study finds that people feel better than usual on days when their competence is higher than usual, that within-person relationship is still usually reported as an average across the sample. So the next question is, how well does that average relationship represent the individuals who contribute to it? For one person, you could have competence and it may be strongly related to changes in affect, and for another, the relationship may be weaker. So for someone else though, autonomy or connection may be more strongly related, and some relationships could potentially differ in direction. So, but I want to mention that when I'm talking about variability or heterogeneity, I'm not simply talking about people having different average levels of autonomy, competence, connection, or well-being. I'm specifically interested in the variability into that need to affect a relationship itself. So that's including differences in its strength or direction across people. And there's also some nuance here. So within SDT, they treat autonomy, competence, and relatedness as basic psychological needs, but that does not require each need to have exactly the same relationship within every outcome for every person or in every context. And so the question is not whether SDTs ever acknowledged individual differences. The more specific question for my thesis is, when we repeatedly observe people over time, how much does their need to affect relationships differ, and how well does the average within person effect represent them? So I did talk a little bit about that just then, but I want to go into a little bit more detail. And as mentioned on the previous slide, SDT already gives strong evidence that needs are related to well-being. The next distinction is where that relationship is being examined. So a between person effect, that here, for example, you've got person A and that could be something related to where they generally feel more competent than person B, and also they generally report better well-being. That is a between person relationship. A within person effect looks at changes within the same person over time. Now, so yeah, we'd ask on days when person A feels more competent than usual, do they also feel better than usual? And we can also take a step further and ask, does the within person need to affect relationship vary across people? So having introduced the problem of the ergodic assumption, that is where this idionomic approach starts to come in as a way to acknowledge it. Now, there's been a growing wave of research looking at psychological processes in a more person-specific way. But the common idea is you're looking more closely at what is happening within individuals before deciding how far we can generalize across them. There's an important nuance here because existing research has already become much more sophisticated than simply calculating one group average, and multi-level models are widely used in repeated measures research because they recognize that observations are nested within people. They can separate within person relationships from between person differences, and they can also include random slopes which allow for the strength of a relationship to differ across people. So for example, rather than saying competence has exactly the same relationship with affect for everybody, a random slope model can recognize that the relationship may be stronger for some people and weak for others. And there's an important advancement, and my judgment argument is not that multi-level models ignore these individual differences. It's the remaining issue is that person level estimates within these models are still partly informed by group level estimates, and through partial pooling, more extreme or uncertain individual estimates are pulled towards the overall mean. And this is often statistically useful because it reduces noise, but it can also make genuinely distinctive individual patterns look somewhat more similar to the group. And I'm going to show you an example on the next slide demonstrating the difference between this idionomic approach and multi-level models. So I want to talk about Sadger and colleagues. So I think it's a useful example. They found that doing what matters was generally associated with better affect, but when they examined the individual patterns more directly, uh, the relationship was much stronger for some people and weaker or absent for others. They found that a multi-level model provided shrinkage to the data and pulled it towards the aggregate, which changes the result. And you were not able to pick up on these differences until they used an idionomic analysis. So the broader result, it wasn't necessarily wrong. The person-specific analysis simply gave us more information about who was actually following that broader pattern. And the idea here is behind the idionomic work shown here is you start closer to the individual, then ask what general patterns are supported. And that brings me to how the idionomic process itself works. So it's got four main steps. So step one is you build a model for each person. And so in SDT, you could look at their own, need to affect relationships. And then step two, so yeah, you can go into there's more detail on that, but that is depending on the relationship, but you have all those models for all those individual people. And step two is you combine the person-specific estimates and bring those effects together. Then step three, you categorize the heterogeneity. So you're asking things like how much do these individual effects differ? Are people similar, or are some effects stronger, weaker, absent, or in a different direction? Then step four, you identify subgroups, but only if feasible. And so if people are that you can sort of start looking at patterns then and making some generalizations on putting people into different groups if they're starting to cluster and look like they've got that similar relationship. So I want to go to talk about study one. This brings me to study one of the PhD. And there's two studies. And so study one is the titles, it's a daily and momentary need satisfaction and affective states. And it's a systematic review of methods and reported
reporting in repeated measure SDT studies. And so note, we're using the term affect, which is quite broad, and it does cover an array of emotional states such as mood and feelings, all in that one umbrella term, hence why I'm sort of saying affect here. And so I want to say that this study was registered on the Open Science Framework, and before screening began, the review protocols, so it was things were quite established, and we did have that registration there. So the closest thing I did find was Coxon and colleagues, and they examined diary research within the workplace context, and it was the only SDT review of repeated measure work I could find. So my review updates the literature by approximately 5 years and broadens the scope beyond work to repeated measure studies across a wider range of contexts. Now, the main contribution there is slightly different from simply asking whether needs and well-being are related. We already have considerable evidence they are, and what I'm particularly interested in is how these conclusions have been reached. Like, have studies clearly separated within-person changes from between-person differences, and have they allowed the relationship between needs and affect to vary across people? And if there was variability, if it was present, did they test it, report it, visualize, or interpret? So study one is really examining the existing literature and can answer the central question to my thesis: and do need to affect relationships operate broadly, similarly across people, or do those relationships vary meaningfully at the individual level? Now, we've got, in terms of progress, in study one, it was well beyond the planning stage. So systematic research went across 11 databases, and so that's all things here. So from health areas to dissertations and multidisciplinary. It was quite diverse in all the databases. And so after meeting with my supervisors, librarians, academics, and various occasions, we worked to lock in the database and finalize search terms. And I did a lot of trial and error preliminary searches and decided that studies needed to repeatedly assess at least one basic psychological need. And because there's 3 of them, so it could be 1, 2, or 3, and then a daily or a momentary affective state. And you can see an example of the search terms and databases on this slide. And importantly, they needed to provide an extractable within-person relationship, because I wanted the review to generally examine how changes in needs relate to changes in affect within the same individuals over time. We came up with a pretty extensive inclusion-exclusion criteria after lots of refinement, and screening was then completed independently by 2 reviewers using coordinates, which was myself and another academic. And when there were disagreements, we discussed them in depth over email, and we went back and forth quite a bit. We often came to a conclusion, but if we couldn't, we had a 3rd reviewer, and they came with the final decision. And so the data extraction is also complete for this study. For each study, I extracted simple information about the sample, repeated measure design, the measures they use, the statistical approach, and any main relevant findings. But importantly, for the thesis, I also coded how each study handled heterogeneity. So did they use multi-level models? Did they use random slopes? And did they look at random slope variance? And how was the variability in the relationship reported? The quality assessment has been completed, and one of the specific quality domains of it is how thoroughly heterogeneity was examined and reported. And so the major methodical stages of study one are complete, and sort of moved into synthesis, interpretation, and final refinement at the moment. Now, here's a bit of an overview from what came out of the screening process. And so there was 383 records identified, and after duplicates were removed, we had 160 remaining for title and abstract screening. 77 were excluded at that stage, which left 83 reports for full text assessment. Following the full text review, another 24 reports were excluded. That resulted in 59 repeated measure studies being included in the final review, and now I have a fairly substantial body of repeated measure SDT research. And one of the major developments since my confirmation of candidature is that the review is now getting some pretty getting some clear findings here, I think, and we can talk about that now. So now, one thing I just wanted to mention was this. It ended up having to look through quite a lot of pretty complicated moderated mediation models, and it was, yeah, when I went through, and it was a bit hard sometimes to figure out if they use random slopes and how, and I spent quite a lot of hours trying to figure out for some papers if they even met the exclusion or inclusion criteria, and I'd find that some of these relationships would sit within bigger models, like need to affect, but it would be within all these other variables all mixed in there. And some used random slopes, but others didn't. And some only used random slopes for other relationships. They didn't really look at it for need to affect, which I thought was kind of interesting. They didn't think it was necessary to do it for that relationship. They only did it for other ones. So there's some preliminary more findings, and I'd say there's been three main findings. And first, there is a very consistent within-person relationship between needs and affect, and all 59 studies reported a need to affect relationship, and 96.6% used multi-level modeling. So the field has already made substantial progress in moving beyond simple between-person comparisons and examining changes within people over time. The second finding, and probably the more interesting one for my thesis, is that much less attention has been given to whether that relationship differs across people, and only 33.9% included random slopes, and only 22% tested whether the random slope variance was meaningful, and that becomes even clearer looking at this graph and how heterogeneity was handled. So none of the studies used an idionomic approach, and around 22% modeled heterogeneity within a multi-level model and reported, and then an 11.9% modeled it but did not clearly report it, and 32.2 mentioned heterogeneity, and 33.9% did not address it at all. And so essentially around 2/3 of the literature only mentioned or did not address heterogeneity at all. And that leads to the third main finding. Individual variability does not be completely ignored, but it has generally remained secondary to the average effect. Even where studies allowed the slopes to vary, the main focus was usually still the pooled within-person relationship, rather than understanding what the variation between individuals looked like. And studies rarely presented individual distributions, profiles, or person-specific patterns. And so the overall picture from study one is quite clear. We have strong evidence that needs and affect are related on average within people, but much weaker evidence about whether the average represents individual people. And importantly, none of the 59 studies started by independently estimating the need to affect relationship for each person and then looking for broader patterns afterwards. And that gives a very clear rationale, I think, for study two, and to take the next step and directly examine now how much this within-person relationship varies from person to person. So study two takes the issue and identified in the review and examines it directly. And so, yeah, this has also been registered on the Open Science Framework. And just want to mention that, so I don't have to, at this stage, don't have to recruit or find the data. I have access to 2 archival data sets, and by meeting and reaching out to the original researchers who agreed and were happy for analysis, so I've got these ones here to take place. So the first data set, we've got 178 adults from the United Kingdom and United States, and there was up to 21 daily observations per participant. It had solitude and social context of the needs. And then the second one is 135 adults in Germany, and it had more daily observations of 42 per person. And this also had dissatisfaction as well as satisfaction. And yeah, it's looking at affect there. So yeah, I think from a feasibility perspective, I think it's study two is a pretty good yeah, we ended up got ethics approval for this paper here, and I think it's in a pretty good position that you've got these data sets, and I'm quite eager and keen to look at look at the broader average pattern and this individual strength and direction, and whether we get any meaningful profiles, the heterogeneity, and once I can get through and look more heavily at this data. So implications and contribution here. So I think SDT, it's already provided strong evidence that autonomy, competence, and connection are broadly beneficial psychological needs, but I don't think it necessarily means that each need has the same immediate relationship with affect for every person. Like, for example, if there is substantial heterogeneity, I think person A might show positive relationships for all three needs, and which with competence, person A here, competence could be more strongly related to their well-being, but for person B, they could show a very different pattern where it's maybe, so where you could have autonomy largely driving and maybe competence is a bit more of a negative impact and connection a bit more neutral. So I think that the important question is whether these person-specific relationships are different. If they are very similar across people, and that strengthens the case the average effect is a good representation of most individuals. And if there is substantial heterogeneity, we can ask whether those differences are structured and potentially explained by context. And so I think it will be interesting to sort of look and see if we can find those profiles. So I'm just getting to the next. Oh, it's freezing up. Oh, here we go. So proposed structure, just about at the end here. I'm thinking 5 chapters and having a broad overview. And chapter 2 would be, the systematic review paper, and then chapter 4, that's study 2. And then a linking chapter in between that sort of can talk about the need for study 2, and then a final chapter, a bit of a general discussion and conclusion. I think that could bring everything together, talk about the implications, future directions, limitations, and make sense of all the papers together and where it's headed and what's found, that type of thing. Now, timeline, this is a bit of a timeline here. So back one. Now, so I've got data set 1, data set 2, and we've got the COC here, mid-review here, and got ethics around here. This is, did a lot of covidence screening, and there has been a lot of a focus on study 1 and 2 within the past year, although probably a bit more study 1. So I'm hoping in the next year to focus quite a bit less on study 1, hence because I have a bit of a full draft written, and then study 2, I want to focus more on the results and kind of synthesizing that, interpreting that data for study 2. And then when I get that data interpreted, get the results and discussion for that. So that would sort of bring things together, I think, have some good drafts and then make final refinements and submit it into a thesis there. So I understand I'm about time now. So just want to thank my supervisors, Baljinder and Joseph, so much for everything they've helped me with, and everyone for listening to the presentation today.
Thank you so much, Sam.
Thanks.
Sorry, Ricky, I just took over. So thank you so much for a well-structured and very clear presentation. I appreciate it very much. And as the chair, I will be asking you one more big picture question about your work to ease you into the panel session. And thanks. That is, you in your thesis, you have convinced me to not average across people in the way we oftentimes do. But in my own work, I've also been convinced that we shouldn't treat people in an isolated way. So when we look at well-being of one person, we need to take into account the context of where that person is. And for example, relationships of one person with another person. And specifically because you do have basic needs and need satisfaction, which are oftentimes, affected by other people and how other people satisfy our needs. I'm just wondering, and this is completely out of the scope of your thesis, so this is just me asking out of interest, of a way you could take that into account, or how those influences could be captured.
So around, I think that in the future where it could head is, I could imagine that, I think, a lot of people use smartphones and things like that. So I'm sure that I could really see it, working out to be in an app or something like that, that has a range of questions, and it can sort of consider the context of who someone is. And yeah, and I suppose you wouldn't want to just, I do understand the purpose of being able to put people in groups, but I think it could be interesting to even compare data points to other people all in one app, but then have things that and I think that's why we're really interested in things like moderators and maybe trying to find more individual moderators and things for people, whether the context or how that's changing that relationship for them. It would be interesting, but who knows? There's a lot of creative people out there, and could be as simple as even a therapist or psychologist. I think sometimes that, the judgments of professionals and other people can sort of take it with a grain of salt and really understand that context and the people around them.
Great. Thanks, Sam. And
Thanks.
with that, I will open to the panel, and I cannot see all of you, so why don't we just start with Emma?
Thanks, Teresa, and thanks, Sam. Great presentation, and I really enjoyed reading your written document as well. Just like
Thanks.
the first time around, it's really easy to follow. It's really well written and nicely structured. I could also see like there was some familiarity in the content in this document, but I could also see just how much you've also done since the COC.
Thank
so
you.
that was great to see as well. I have like a sort of pie in the sky question. You create a really compelling rationale for looking at, between versus within person effects.
Yeah.
And the RQ3 for your study 2 is, if we find substantial heterogeneity, we'll explore that with profiles and subgroups. What if you don't find it? What will you write in your discussion if you don't find substantial heterogeneity?
Yeah. I think then it'd probably be quite similar, I'd imagine, to what there was another review, the Coxon one, about 5 years ago, and I'd imagine the implications or like the results and discussion will be quite similar to probably what they suggest, in that it probably will be, maybe it will, and if that happens, won't be as if you could sort of reject the idea that you need to put people into groups, and maybe you could go, this is sort of, we can have a bit more of a one-size-fits-all approach. We don't have to think as much for this person at this time. Is it going to vary a lot? We can go, so you haven't met your autonomy here, and we can kind of do a bit more of I don't know if it's cookie cutter is the right word, but to me, that's what it's sort of suggesting. It's like you got those 3 needs and be like, just look at the person in front of you. And I think you could just go quite confidently of what all the wealth of SDT knowledge already says in the past and follow that.
Yeah, so you're so much deeper in it now than you were at the COC point, having read all the papers for the systematic review and done some narrative synthesis on their content. Are you pretty convinced that you propose like prototypical examples of someone who would fit a typical normothetic trend versus an idiographic kind of deviation from that normal trend? Are you pretty convinced that those more hypothetical examples are really there in real people from what you've read?
Oh, yeah, I think so. Like, I just think so, even just thinking about, like, because some of the papers, and there's one in particular is quite interesting. I think it was talking a lot about one of them I came across, I think. Well, there's a few, but so one of them was about cross-culture, and to me it just sounded perfect sense, like saying in certain, I don't know, especially from the east to the west, like about autonomy, like having a different kind of need. I'm like, that made total sense to me, hearing that. And then like even just people talking about like video gamers, someone did a really interesting PhD on that, and I thought, I mean, I suppose who knows, but when I am reading and hearing about people arguing cases for different people, and like have to acknowledge that they just respond quite differently to where because as everyone would know, a lot of the science is quite, Western educated, democratic sort of areas. So I am pretty convinced, but you have to really
Yes.
say until we look at the data.
That's right. Well, I'm excited to follow you on the journey and find what you
Thanks.
find.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing, Sam.
Yeah, cheers.
All right, Kyung, do you have any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Teresa, and well done, Sam.
Yeah.
Really good to hear a very strong presentation here, and
Yeah.
you clearly demonstrate your understanding of this idionomic approach,
Okay, thanks.
which I must admit took me several years to wrap my head around, and I'm still wrapping my head around it.
Yeah.
Now, I've got a couple of questions, and it may be that it's still early in the stage of your working on the systematic review. So you may or may not have these answers yet. One thing I noticed in your write-up is that you've got these overarching research questions that will filter through all your papers. At the moment, I'm seeing one major research question being addressed, which is this question of heterogeneity. But you also have other research questions that are so interesting, like I'm just pulling it up right now, and you were saying to what extent do the within person need effect associations vary across? So that's the heterogeneity one. But then you ask what demographic and contextual or methodological factors may account for this heterogeneity. When you've looked in the system in all these papers, have you seen any consistent patterns just at the group level with regards to these needs and affect associations? Because if there are these consistent patterns, the question would be, can we see them when we look in using an idionomic approach? What has your review shown you with that research question?
Yeah. So, and so are you saying essentially, have I found like things that are a bit, anything that's a bit striking or a little bit more different in explaining things like a little bit more?
The consistent patterns.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of interesting. Like and this is what did surprise me a lot, is what I thought was going to happen was I thought it was going to have need to affect, and then I thought they were going to have that as a really central part of the model, and I thought they would have like moderators and really trying to go into detail to explain it and look at all these factors. But what I found is, and it has sort of surprised me, is a lot of people they sort of just seem to really jump off that idea, and they seem to just look at other factors. I think there was a slide I did show with like all those mediated moderators, and they were kind of going really off topic and diverging off the need to affect and bringing on all these other variables. And they were really interested in the variance and moderators of those other distant relationships, but they're like, oh, as a need to affect, that's a given. Don't worry about the variability heaps of that. Let's worry about variability of this other stuff. So it's kind of diverged off it a lot. So I was kind of surprised by that, like, because they thought other people had already done it, but it seems like maybe a lot of people had the same feeling. Yeah.
Right. So at the group level, they haven't they've taken they've assumed the need effect relationship is a given.
It's like a given because it's been around for so
they haven't
long, and
examined
just
the
don't worry about it
heterogeneity
as
in
much.
detail.
Yeah.
That's it. Very interesting. Now, moving on to the analysis.
Yeah.
How far are you on along the way with learning the analytical approach, the idionomic approach? How are you going with that?
Yeah. Well, I think as you said yourself, it has taken me a while to wrap my head around it. Like at first I thought I knew it, and so I think like I spent, I'd tell people it's like this, idionomic, you do this, and like, oh yeah, we've always been interested in individuals, but it's a different question. Like it's taken me months or, I think, well, I think my theoretical understanding of it is pretty good. Like now I can I really can wrap my head around, you start with the individuals, like you meta-analyze, you categorize heterogeneity and that. But I I don't know how to like code it all in Python, for example. I don't know how to do that, but I know Joseph and Belginder are a lot better. Like, I mean, they would be a lot more skilled in that than what I would. So I think my understanding of it's quite good, like theoretically, but in terms of actually getting up like Python and getting all the data, I've probably got a fair bit more to learn with that, and I'm hoping for their guidance for that part. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's good you've got the foundation, and now it's about learning the process of doing and using, deciding on the algorithms and all of that.
Because
then
it's like
putting into
I
R
think
and working there. So all the best with that.
I ended up doing, that's something I haven't mentioned, but I did a course there was an ACU one. I got an email offering a course, and I did a few days of that. I found it like a day and a half. I found it really confusing, but I don't know. It's probably, I was learning something though, I suppose, I tried to like understand it a bit, but it was quite complicated, especially not having a very strong programming background. Yeah.
Keep working at it, and it'll pay off, not just now, but in your career as well. As you move forward. Now, one last question. And you may have put that into your document. I didn't see it. You've got 2 data sets. But you're presenting it as one study. Why not 2 studies?
Well, I think it was just that I'm pretty sure it came a bit from Herb Marsh last year. Like, we had one data set, and then I think he was suggesting for it to have a bit more, I don't know if you'd say weighting behind it or giving it a bit more body, the paper. I think he was sort of saying, it'd be good if you could get another one to like, and then I was just thinking it might be nice to, because it's just an analysis of an archival one, I can sort of compare and talk about the difference between the two within the one paper rather than doing 2 separate. Because I think I'm trying to like bring everything together and look at things a bit more as a whole. And I suppose it is an idea to separate them, but to me, I like that idea of comparing and contrasting and evaluating, especially because it's like, you got the UK, the US, and Germany. I think it's interesting there. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. All the best with your research, Sam.
Thank you.
Thanks for that.
Thanks for that.
Thanks, Keon. If there's nothing from the panel, I would open up for everybody else to ask questions. Please raise your hand in Teams because I can't see everybody. JMR, you go ahead.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Samuel. I have a very general question. And for me, the defining criteria for a successful dissertation is the creation of new knowledge. So I see 2 studies that review the literature, but could you tell me what the new knowledge, the new data, the new hypothesis that you have, what's that in your dissertation?
So I think that is very much around the idea, because at the moment it's a very, as I've found, it's not a very, I've noticed that it'll be leading a bit more towards, I think, you have to wait and see to analyze the data. But I think what the new knowledge is that I've gotten to the grains of heterogeneity here, where the Coxon paper, I feel like it didn't really, it was more just sort of reviewing, or like, do needs to affect matter. And here it's like answering questions like, all researchers, I feel they're not talking about the variability of the need to affect link. They're not, even if they are on the rare chance, they're not plotting person-specific estimates. And I feel like that's generating something that hasn't been out there before. And then I have to wait and see for study 2, but I think the new knowledge could be there is that this sort of subgroup, there might be like 3 or 4 different subgroups we might come up with in that data, that there is someone at a time in their life where autonomy is drastically driving well-being, and it's got such a large weighting, where for someone else, autonomy, it would be an assumption to say, increase your autonomy, it's a bit low, you'll get better. But for someone else, that there might be connection that is a lot larger. So I think it might be able to help answer those questions.
Okay, great. I just ask you to keep an open mind about a possible study 3, where you actually follow up on some of those findings. And okay, great.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, if there is one. No, and I'll call it. Thank you so much to everybody who attended today. I'd ask the panel to stay online, and for everybody else, including you, Sam, to leave. And thank you again so much. That was a great presentation. Great job. You're doing amazing.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thanks, everyone. Bye.